I shouldn't have opened the file, I told myself the moment I clicked on the encrypted link. But it was already too late. What I saw would not only shake Burkina Faso, it would shake Africa. My name is Adam Keita, a freelance investigative journalist from Mali. I've spent over a decade chasing corruption, coups, and whispers in hotel corridors, but I've never, not once, come across a betrayal this deep, this personal, and this dangerous. The leak came at 3:14 a.m., buried inside a Proton Mail inbox I barely use. No name, no signature, just a subject line. Traoré isn't safe, they've sold him out, here's proof. I hesitated before clicking. I've been burned before. But when I saw the IP address bouncing through 5 countries, the last one being Nairobi, I knew this wasn't fake. It was a breadcrumb from someone who knew what they were doing. The file was just 22 seconds long, garbled, panicked, but unmistakable. Listen, this is between us. Ruto agreed. He said Traoré's push against the IMF is putting all of us at risk. The West promised to restore aid if we isolate him. Don't tell anyone yet, but the plan is moving fast. I replayed it. Again and again. William Ruto, President of Kenya. One of the few African leaders Traoré had trusted, had stood beside, smiled with, talked about Pan-African unity with. And now he was allegedly plotting to isolate him in exchange for Western aid? If this was real, and every instinct in my body screamed that it was, then something massive was coming, bigger than just politics. This was betrayal, and betrayal, when done quietly, usually ends in blood. I knew the consequences. If I went public, I could be silenced. If I stayed quiet, Traoré could be eliminated. But then I received a second file. This one wasn't audio. It was a private WhatsApp screenshot between a Ruto aide and an EU liaison. The message read, "We'll push the narrative that Traoré is destabilizing West Africa. France is on board. If you can secure Ghana's silence, Kenya will handle the media framing." This was coordinated. They weren't just betraying Traoré. They were preparing the world to watch it happen and believe he deserved it. Just 3 weeks earlier, I'd watched Traoré and Ruto embrace in Addis Ababa at the African Union summit. There was tension, sure, but no signs of this level of fracture. The press thought they were united against the West's grip. I did too. But behind the speeches and flags, something else was boiling. Ruto had always been careful, too careful. Unlike Traoré, he played both sides. He never truly cut the West off. He promised reforms, but still took IMF loans. Traoré, he had gone rogue, burned the bridges, built his own road. That made him dangerous, not just to the West, but to the African leaders still holding the West's hand. I had to move quickly. I contacted a fixer in Ouagadougou. I needed to get closer to the presidential circle without alerting anyone. If I published the leak too early, I'd be discredited. Or worse. But something else was happening. Traoré had disappeared from public view. No speeches, no military parades, no public visits. Rumors began to spread. He's sick. He's been poisoned. He found out about the betrayal and went underground. I sat in a cramped cafe on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a weak Wi-Fi signal fighting with the dust to keep my laptop alive. Every few minutes, the same message pinged across my encrypted chat window. You don't know who you're dealing with. But I did know, or at least I was starting to. The deeper I dug into the betrayal of President Ibrahim Traoré, the more it felt like I was unearthing a continent-wide conspiracy. And now I was starting to suspect that the leak, this private message that ignited a firestorm, was only the surface of something much darker. What nobody knew, not even Traoré, from what I could tell, was that the message wasn't leaked by accident. It wasn't intercepted. It was placed, intentionally, as bait. The source who gave it to me, who called himself K3Mba, had gone silent. His last message was voice only, and his voice was trembling. This message, it was sent to isolate him. Your president is walking into a trap, and the person who said it wears the same badge as him. That phrase haunted me. Wears the same badge. Someone from within the Pan-African Alliance? Someone he trusted? It couldn't be. Could it? The leaked message was supposedly from a close African ally, a president from East Africa. It criticized Traoré's refusal to accept Western aid, calling him naive, too idealistic, and a destabilizing figure for the region. It accused him of dividing Africa when unity demands compromise with the West. But something didn't add up. The language was too polished, too well aimed. It was exactly the kind of message Western agencies would want to circulate. And yet, the IP data on the leak showed it originated from a government server in a capital that claimed to support Traoré. So who sent it? And why now? 2 days later, I was smuggled into a small apartment above a radio station in Cotonou, Benin. The walls were covered in maps of military installations, flags of ECOWAS countries, and blurry satellite images. My contact, who asked me to call her Fatim, didn't bother with small talk. Your story has been rerouted, she said, handing me a USB drive. This is what you were supposed to find in a month, but you don't have a month, neither does Traoré. She pulled down a photo from the wall. It was a meeting, grainy but recognizable. Traoré, the East African president, and between them, a tall, sharp-suited man with sunglasses. Ignore the leaders, she whispered. Look at him. Who is he? That's the question you should be asking Traoré. His name doesn't appear on any guest list, but that man's voice is the one in the leaked message. I froze. You're saying the message wasn't from the president of Redacted? No, but it was recorded in his office. Someone mimicked his voice. Deepfake, audio manipulation. Who? Fatim stared at me with tired eyes. That's not the story. The story is, who let him? I left Benin the next day, carrying the USB and 100 more questions. I didn't know it then, but while I crossed the border into Togo, Traoré was flying back from a visit to Guinea, and on that plane, unbeknownst to him, was a private intelligence contractor from Nairobi. He wasn't listed on the manifest, but his sat phone was pinging a secure channel labeled Hermes Beige, a network linked to former intelligence agents across the Sahel. The betrayal wasn't a leak, it was a setup, not just to humiliate Traoré, but to isolate him, politically, militarily, emotionally. And the worst part? It was working. In the days after the leak, 3 African nations withdrew from a regional summit proposed by Burkina Faso. One of them cited recent tensions and the need for distance. International media picked it up immediately, claiming Traoré had lost favor. He hadn't lost favor. Favor had been taken from him, surgically, silently. At that point, the narrative was no longer about the content of the message. It was about the trust it shattered. And I was the only one who knew where the fracture started. It wasn't in a speech. It wasn't in a secret email. It was in the look Traoré gave when asked about the betrayal. Not anger, not denial, just silence. And that silence told me he knew something I didn't. Or worse, he knew who. Traoré didn't flinch. As the world spun from the leaks, from the betrayal, from the fear of what would follow, the man at the center of it all remained rooted. Not in power, but in purpose. I returned to Ouagadougou to seek an interview. Not with officials, not with spokespeople, but with the man himself. It took days. I was passed from barracks to ministries, from aid workers to officers, each of them with that same unwavering gaze, sharp, proud, unafraid, as if Traoré had embedded his own defiance into every layer of his country. Then one evening, a soldier knocked on my guest house door and silently motioned for me to follow. They drove me through the outskirts, past roads where tractors now moved in formation, not tanks, past farmlands blooming from the canal that had once been just an impossible dream, and finally into a modest compound where the flags of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger flanked a single wooden chair. He was already there, sitting, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, no guards, no cameras, just the weight of the world on his shoulders, and yet something close to peace in his eyes. Sit, he said. I sat. You know why you're here, he continued, but I will speak only once, not for politics, not for defense, but for the truth. I clicked on my recorder. He looked toward the horizon. You've seen what happens when African leaders sell secrets, when they think the West will protect them, when they trade loyalty for luxury. But betrayal never begins with others. It begins when we doubt ourselves. I asked him if he knew who leaked the message, if he suspected the ally. He nodded once. Yes. Do you plan to expose them? He smiled faintly. No. They already exposed themselves. Africa saw. That was the thing about Traoré. He didn't play the game. He flipped the board. While journalists hunted scandal, he built resilience. While the world looked for weakness, he showed them unity. But how do you fight when you're surrounded? I asked. Your allies are compromised. Sanctions loom. And NATO. He raised a hand. There's something the West doesn't understand, he interrupted. You cannot surround a people who've decided they will never kneel again. You cannot isolate a soul that has tasted freedom. Silence followed, not awkward, sacred. I asked him one final question. What happens now? Traoré stood slowly. He gestured toward a wall map. Not of Burkina Faso, but of all of Africa. Hand-drawn lines of new railways, water routes, joint medical research hubs, solar grids, defense networks. Then he turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. Now? He looked me in the eye. Now Africa stops waiting. The next day, I was escorted to the airport. No dramatic farewells, no headlines waiting. But I knew what I had witnessed wasn't just a story. It was a new chapter in African history being carved in real time. As the jet lifted off, I looked down at the fields below, green, strong, fed by the Canal Traoré built without a dollar from the West. And in that moment, I understood what had truly been leaked. Not just a betrayal, but a revolution. And this time, the world would not be ready. If this story moved you, don't just watch, share. The world needs to hear what mainstream media won't tell. Like if you believe Africa deserves dignity, share if you stand against betrayal and for justice. Comment your thoughts. Is Africa finally rising on its own terms? And subscribe, because more stories like this are coming, and the next one might just shake the world again.